This is the first of two lecture videos I'm going to make for the PowerPoint that is in Module 1. It is called Environmental Science, and it corresponds to your textbook chapter. So for the first video, I will be discussing the field of environmental science and then the process of science. Now, I'm putting the learning objectives before each section in the PowerPoint, but you can also refer to a learning objective page in your module. So these are the skills and knowledge that I want you to take away from this material. So first we have the field of environmental science. So I want you to be able to define what environmental science is and also come up with a couple reasons for studying this field. So here I have given you the definition of environmental science, and this is similar to the one that you will find in your textbook. So one thing to remember about this field is that it is interdisciplinary, meaning that it combines information and practitioners from different fields like geology, right? The study of rocks and like fossils, things like that. It combines people who work in chemistry, in physics. All of these fields apply to environmental science. And in fact, we need to understand these different areas in order to make sense of the world around us. Now, it's interdisciplinary, like I said, and for environmental science, we're basically studying the interactions between living and non-living parts of the ecosystem or the environment. But it also includes the impacts from humans and looks at how humans fit into this larger global ecosystem. Now here I've given you just a very short video to watch. It says, what is environmental science? Defining the scope of the field. And it pretty much provides the information that I want you to know about this field. And it closely matches what you will see in your textbook. So I'm not going to show the video. You can go back on your own and watch this video. But basically, it gives some reasons for entering this field, right? Why are we even part of the environmental science field? Now, myself, I was trained as a conservation biologist. In fact, I studied pollinators, or I still do. And one of the things I looked at in my own research is how agriculture and urbanization, right, the development of cities affects our bee communities in grassland areas. And bees, as you may or may not know, are one of the most important pollinators that we have on the planet. About 1/3 of all of the food that you eat comes from bee pollination. So when I look at issues with pollinators, one of the reasons that I study this and why conservation biologists and scientists study different questions in this field is that we need to know how humans affect ecosystem function. And what I mean by this, so if you take pollinators, how do humans affect the communities of pollinators? Like, how are we going to affect our food supply when we alter the environment? And that is a really important question. So human population is currently at about 7 billion, and it is going to continue to increase at least for a few years. Projections as to how large the human population will grow vary. But we need to understand these things about ecosystem function and our impact, because we are getting to the point that our ecosystems are stressed. And if we don't start to address these issues, the world that we live in will lose the capacity to produce food, for example. if our soil is depleted, if our pollinators are gone. So we need to make sure that these processes stay in place. And so one of the reasons to study environmental science as a summary is so that we know how humans affect the world, because the human population is growing and we want to make sure that these environmental processes still function. Now, another reason to study environmental science is linked to the first reason, right? Human population is growing. Well, environmental science increases or improves our understanding of how everything functions in the world around us. And as I said before, this includes the interactions between humans and other organisms. So once we understand how these things work together, we can try to find solutions to problems like losing our pollinators, right? We cannot come up with effective solutions if we don't understand how everything works. So those are two major reasons to enter this field or to study questions that are in this field. Now, the next part of this PowerPoint covers the process of science. Now, you probably have all heard about the scientific method, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but there are a few items that I do need you to know. So your learning objectives are to identify the steps of the scientific method. You're going to compare inductive and deductive reasoning and describe the goals of basic versus applied science. So I like this quote: "There is no skepticism without science and the scientific method. It's about how we know what we know." So I actually didn't know who Steven Novella is, but I looked it up. He's a neurologist and he's a professor at Yale University School of Medicine. So this guy's pretty cool. He does a podcast with another scientist and then like his brother, and they talk about being skeptical of like conspiracy theories and things you hear on social media. And so this quote from him is very applicable to the scientific method, right? That we really need to put our faith and belief in things that hold up under scientific scrutiny. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not referring to like religion or anything like that. When I say our faith, is what I mean is that we need to critically look at what we are being told, critically evaluate it, and whether or not it is backed up by science. Now, this diagram here is different than the one in your book, but what I like about it is it provides a little explanation under each step. Also, it shows it in a cycle, because it's not really a linear process. Right? We've always learned the scientific method as being very rigid. You make an observation, you ask a question, you generate a hypothesis, but in reality, it does not always work that way. As a scientist, we do follow that general framework, but a lot of times we skip a step or, do things out of order. So let's go through these. The first step is to make observations. Now, when I say make observations, you are looking at natural phenomena that you see in nature or the world around you. So it says here, this can be from one's own experiences, thoughts, or reading. And I think that's really important because a lot of times I will become interested in a scientific question, not from going out and visually observing something, but I will be reading scientific papers and I will think, well, I wonder if they looked at this, or I wonder if they looked at that. So it means make observations. It applies to all kinds of things. Now, after that, you try to think of an interesting question. Why does that pattern occur? That's what it says on the slide here. Now, obviously, experiment and what we call observational studies are trying to answer a question. So it has to be a question that you can test. So I think your book gives the example, a testable question would not be, I wonder what a bear thinks, I don't know, when it's catching salmon in the river. Well, obviously that is not a question we can answer. There is no way we can know how a bear thinks. I liked that example because it really puts it out there, right? There's just no way to answer that. So that would not be a good scientific question. Now, after we think of a question, we formulate a hypothesis. Now, this is really important. You've probably heard of a hypothesis as being an educated guess. Well, this is kind of true, but to me, a hypothesis is a probable explanation to your question. So I'm actually going to add that to the slide. A lot of times I like to annotate or type on my slides so that you have the information and don't have to remember what I say. So a hypothesis is a probable explanation to your question. Now, what I want you to remember here is it is what I call a because statement. Now I'm going to apply this to an example in my next few slides so that you can see what I mean here. So what you want to do with the hypothesis is say, okay, I think that this is the answer because of this. It's that because that makes it an explanation. Now, next, and developing a prediction and setting up your experiment kind of go hand in hand. So your prediction is based on the hypothesis, and this is your if-then statement. And a lot of times this is taught incorrectly, and people tell you that the hypothesis is the if-then statement, but it's actually the prediction. So I'm going to type this out for you. An if-then, statement about what you expect to observe as a result of your experiment or study. I'm going to put or study in there, and I'll explain why. So there are two types of scientific studies. There's what we call experimental, and this is what you typically think of like in a lab, or you have two groups of people and some are given a medication and some are given a placebo. Well, that is an experimental study, but there are also observational studies. I have a question and then I go out in nature and I observe a bunch of factors to see if they are related to one another. So observational studies are what I have done in the past. I have done some experimental, but primarily it's observational. So I wanted to know if proximity to an urban area affects a bee community. Now that's observational, right? Because I'm looking at a town or a city and the grassland around it. So I'm not setting that up. That's not in a lab. It's not controlled, right? I don't have a control group and an experimental group. It's observational. I select some sites that are close to urban areas, some sites that are far away from urban areas, and I look at what bees are there. So it is observational. Now, the next couple slides where I give you an example is also observational. So your prediction is what you expect to observe from your experiment or study. Now, the prediction is based on the hypothesis. Okay, you have your probable explanation, and this guides you as to what you think you'll see in the experiment. So the next step would be gather data. Now, I want to make one correction here. It says to test predictions. So the experiment tests your hypothesis, not your prediction. I mean, they're closely related, right? But technically, an experiment tests the hypothesis. It's just this is the image I found that worked really well, but it's wrong on that one point. Now, your data or the results either support your hypothesis or disprove it. Now, we don't say that your hypothesis is proven, right? We never say that in science because you cannot 100% say something is true. Now, you can have a ton of evidence indicating that something is true, but you can't say 100%, right? There's always going to be something you haven't looked at. Now, the last part here says develop general theories. This is really important. The word theory in science is used differently than the word theory in like media or the general public. A theory in the scientific field is an explanation that can account for many different situations. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that a theory explains a lot of different observations that you make, and it has been tested and tested and tested. Like a ton of tests have supported the theory. So there's very little doubt that it is not true. So like the theory of evolution, right? There are so many different lines of evidence that support evolution as being the process leading to diversity of life. Okay, so it's been tested in numerous ways, and all of these results support that evolution occurs. That's why it is elevated to a theory. Now, that's opposed to like general media, things like that, where people always say, well, I have a theory about that. That's different. Having a theory about something means that's what you think is going on, right? That's not how we think about theories in the scientific field. So now I'm going to move on to a sample study so that we can apply some of these concepts. So let's say I'm out in the forest. I'm out bird watching, and I notice that a species of sparrow has made all of its nest with grass instead of twigs. Right? A lot of times we think of bird nest, a bunch of twigs put together, maybe some grass, but it's got to have sticks in it, right? Make it strong. Well, I'm out walking around. I notice all these nests are made of grass. And so my question is, why are the nests made with grass rather than twigs? Now, this is something I can test. So my hypothesis, remember that this is a because statement, a probable explanation to my question. My hypothesis is that sparrows are using grass for their nests instead of twigs because grass is most abundant in their habitat, in that specific area that those sparrows are living in. Right, I look around me, I see a ton of different grasses, but I don't see a lot of twigs. That's why I think the sparrows use grass. Well, that is my hypothesis. Now, let's say I am going to research this. What I would do is go into habitats that have mostly grass and look at what the nests are made of. Then I would go into areas with mostly twigs and look at what the sparrow nests are made of. Okay, observational study. So my prediction, this is my if-then statement, what I expect to observe. So if sparrows are using grass because it is more abundant, and I compare areas with grass and areas with twigs, then I expect the nest to be made of twigs in areas that have more twigs. Right, so my whole explanation in my hypothesis is that it's the availability of grass versus twigs that determines what the nest is made of. Therefore, if I go to an area with lots of twigs, you would think the nest would be made of twigs. I wrote here what comes after the prediction. That would be the experiment or study, and the collection of data. You would either support or disprove your hypothesis. So that is the depth I am going to get into for the scientific method, and we'll revisit this throughout the semester so that you can leave the course understanding how to look at information critically based on the scientific method. So there are two more things I need you to know. That is the first one is the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. Now, we use both of these types of reasoning in science, but they're different, right? And you may have heard of these before. So inductive reasoning uses specific information or observations to make a broad generalization or statement. So I'm looking at really specific things, and from that, I am coming up with a general statement. So you're going specific to general. So the example I have here is the left-handed people I know use left-handed scissors. Well, that's specific, right? I'm talking about the people I know. Therefore, all left-handed people use left-handed scissors. So I'm taking my specific observation of the people I know and generalizing that to the entire left-handed population. Okay. Now, deductive reasoning, and this is what we use to form hypotheses. So this is going from general to specific. I take a general observation and I make specific conclusions. So here are some observations. All dolphins are mammals. That's pretty broad. All mammals have kidneys, right? I should have written specific conclusion here, is that all dolphins have kidneys. Okay, I'm narrowing it down. First, I'm talking about dolphins like being mammals and mammals having kidneys. So the specific conclusion is that all dolphins have kidneys. Okay. So that's why I say it is used to form a hypothesis, because after I come up with my specific conclusion, I'm either going to support or disprove it. Now, the last thing that you need to know about the scientific method is the difference between basic and applied science. So I liked this image. It shows basic science as being like the trunk of the tree and the branches, right? Applied science, I guess that should be a branch coming off there. Applied science kind of comes out of the trunk, right? It's the leaves and the branches, and the apple is the application. So what this means is that basic science gives us information just for the sake of information, right? So when Watson and Crick went out to study DNA, they weren't going to apply this information, the structure of DNA, to anything. They just wanted to know, what is the structure of DNA? And I have to point out, though, that Rosalind Franklin was really responsible for discovering the structure of DNA. Anyway, that is basic science, right? You are just finding things out just for the sake of doing it. But this is really important because it gives us the information we need for applied science. Applied science is doing studies or experiments with the intention of putting the results to use, right? To coming up with solutions to problems, to forming medication or medical devices, right? Applied science, you are actually trying to make a product, and I don't mean just for monetary reasons, but you are trying to make something with that information, or you're trying to address a problem. Now, the combination of basic and applied science gives you that application. So the example that the book gave, which I really liked, was, again, going back to DNA. Basic science taught us about the structure of DNA and how it carries genetic information. But applied science takes that information about DNA and develops ways to alter genes that cause diseases, right? That is applied science. You're taking the information about DNA, you're altering people's genetic information so that they do not suffer from genetic diseases. So that is the interaction between basic and applied science. So the next recording will cover sustainability, environmental ethics, and environmental justice.